Sarah Martinez never imagined that the happiest day of her life would turn into her worst nightmare. The 28-year-old kindergarten teacher from Chicago had been planning her dream wedding to Marcus Thompson for 18 months. Every detail was perfect, from the vintage lace dress she found at a small boutique to the roses she specially ordered from her grandmother's favorite florist. The morning of October 15th started like any fairy tale. Sarah woke up in her childhood bedroom surrounded by her bridesmaids who had been giggling and preparing since dawn. Her mother, Elena, bustled around the house making sure everything was ready for the ceremony at St. Catherine's Church. The guest list included 150 people, mostly family and close friends from their small community. What Sarah didn't know was that among the guests sat a man who had been watching her every move for months. Vincent Rossi wasn't supposed to be there. He was the nephew of Antonio Rossi, one of Chicago's most feared crime family leaders. Vincent had first seen Sarah 6 months earlier when she was grocery shopping near his legitimate business, a restaurant in Little Italy. Something about her genuine smile and the way she helped an elderly woman reach a high shelf made him obsessed. Vincent began following Sarah's daily routine. He learned she taught at Maple Elementary School, that she volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, and that she was engaged to Marcus, a construction foreman. The more Vincent watched, the more convinced he became that Sarah was meant to be with him, not Marcus. In his twisted mind, he believed she was just trapped in the wrong relationship. The wedding ceremony began beautifully. Sarah walked down the aisle in her flowing white dress, her father proudly by her side. Marcus stood at the altar with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by how stunning his bride looked. The church was filled with warm light streaming through stained glass windows, and everyone could feel the love between the couple. Vincent sat in the back row, wearing a borrowed suit and a fake invitation he had printed. He told anyone who asked that he was a distant cousin of the bride. His hands shook as he watched Sarah say her vows, promising to love Marcus forever. Each word felt like a knife in his chest. He had convinced himself that if he could just talk to Sarah alone, he could make her understand that they belonged together. The ceremony concluded with cheers and rice being thrown as Sarah and Marcus ran to their decorated car. They were heading to the reception at the Riverside Country Club, a beautiful venue overlooking Lake Michigan. Vincent followed at a distance in his black sedan, his mind racing with a plan he had been developing for weeks. At the reception, Sarah danced with her new husband as their families celebrated around them. The DJ played their favorite songs while guests enjoyed dinner and shared embarrassing stories about the couple. Sarah's grandmother gave a touching speech about true love lasting forever. For a few hours, everything was exactly as Sarah had dreamed. Vincent waited outside in the parking lot, watching through the windows. He had studied the venue's layout and knew about the service entrance near the kitchen. His plan was simple, but dangerous. He would create a distraction, grab Sarah during the confusion, and take her somewhere they could talk privately. In his deluded state, he believed once she heard how much he loved her, she would choose him over Marcus. As the evening progressed, Sarah stepped outside to get some fresh air and take photos with her photographer near the lake. The area was slightly secluded, with only a few other guests nearby. This was the moment Vincent had been waiting for. He approached slowly, his heart pounding with nervousness and excitement. When Sarah noticed the unfamiliar man walking toward her, she initially smiled politely, thinking he might be a guest she hadn't met yet. But something about his intense stare and the way he kept looking around nervously made her uncomfortable. The photographer was busy adjusting his equipment and didn't notice the approaching stranger. Vincent introduced himself as a friend of the family and complimented Sarah on her beautiful wedding. His voice was shaky, and he kept stepping closer despite Sarah's obvious discomfort. When she politely tried to return to the reception, Vincent gently grabbed her arm and insisted they needed to talk about something important regarding her future. Sarah's instincts told her something was very wrong. She tried to pull away, but Vincent's grip tightened. He whispered urgently that she was making a huge mistake marrying Marcus and that he could offer her a better life. The photographer finally looked up and noticed the situation, immediately sensing trouble. Before anyone could react properly, Vincent pulled out a small handgun from his jacket pocket. He didn't point it directly at Sarah, but made sure she could see it. His voice became more desperate as he explained that he just needed her to come with him for a short conversation. He promised he wouldn't hurt her if she cooperated. Sarah's blood turned cold as she realized she was being kidnapped on her wedding day. The photographer dropped his camera and slowly backed away, unsure whether to run for help or stay to protect the bride. Vincent noticed his hesitation and ordered him to leave immediately, threatening that anyone who interfered would regret it. The next few minutes felt like hours to Sarah. Vincent led her toward his car parked behind some trees, constantly looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was following. Inside the reception hall, Marcus was beginning to wonder where his wife had gone. He asked several guests if they had seen Sarah, but everyone assumed she was just freshening up or taking more photos. Vincent opened the passenger door of his sedan and told Sarah to get inside. She pleaded with him to let her go back to her wedding, explaining that people would start looking for her soon. But Vincent was beyond reasoning. He had convinced himself that once they were alone, he could make her understand his feelings, and she would willingly come with him. As Sarah reluctantly got into the car, she noticed Vincent was sweating heavily, and his hands were trembling. She realized he was just as scared as she was, which somehow made the situation even more terrifying. Vincent wasn't a professional criminal. He was an unstable man acting on dangerous impulses, making him completely unpredictable. The car pulled away from the country club just as Marcus came outside looking for his bride. He saw the taillights disappearing down the road but thought nothing of it, assuming it was just another guest leaving early. Back inside, the celebration continued, with no one yet aware that the bride had vanished. Vincent drove in silence for several minutes, while Sarah tried to stay calm and think of a way to escape. She studied his profile, noticing the expensive watch and well-groomed appearance that suggested he wasn't a typical street criminal. This observation would later prove crucial in understanding who had taken her and why. The car headed toward the outskirts of Chicago, moving further away from everything Sarah knew and loved. Through the window, she watched the city lights fade into darkness, wondering if she would ever see Marcus or her family again. Her beautiful wedding dress was now wrinkled and stained with tears she couldn't stop from falling. Vincent finally spoke, his voice softer now, but still filled with an intensity that frightened Sarah. He told her about the restaurant he owned and the comfortable life he could provide for her. He described watching her for months and convinced himself that the looks she gave strangers were actually meant for him. Sarah realized she was dealing with someone who had created an entire fantasy relationship in his mind. The car turned onto a dark country road, leaving Sarah to wonder where this nightmare would end and whether anyone would find her in time. Behind them, the wedding reception was finally beginning to notice that the bride had been missing for too long, setting in motion a desperate search that would change everyone's lives forever. Marcus Thompson felt his stomach drop when the photographer approached him with a panicked expression. The young man explained that he had seen Sarah talking to a stranger near the lake, and then both of them had disappeared. At first, Marcus thought maybe Sarah had gone inside to use the restroom or fix her makeup, but a quick search of the country club revealed she was nowhere to be found. The wedding guests initially assumed there was a simple explanation. Perhaps Sarah had stepped out to get something from the bridal suite or was taking more photos in a different location. But as 30 minutes turned into an hour, the celebration atmosphere began shifting into concern, then fear. Elena Martinez, Sarah's mother, became hysterical when she realized her daughter was truly missing. She insisted that Sarah would never leave her own wedding reception without telling someone. Marcus organized the male guests into search teams to check the grounds, the parking lot, and the nearby lakefront. They found Sarah's small purse dropped near the spot where the photographer had last seen her. Meanwhile, Vincent drove Sarah to an old farmhouse about 40 miles outside Chicago. The property belonged to his uncle Antonio, though Vincent hadn't told anyone in the family about his plan. He had discovered the abandoned house during a family meeting 6 months earlier and thought it would be the perfect place to have an honest conversation with Sarah about their future together. The farmhouse was isolated, surrounded by empty fields, and accessible only by a long dirt road. Vincent had prepared the place over several weeks, bringing food, water, and basic supplies. In his twisted logic, he thought Sarah might need time to understand her feelings for him, so he wanted to make sure she was comfortable during their stay. Sarah's terror increased when she saw how remote their location was. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away, and her chances of being found or escaping seemed impossible. Vincent led her inside the house, which was dusty but furnished with old furniture covered in white sheets. He had set up a bedroom with clean linens and even brought some of Sarah's favorite foods, which he knew about from watching her grocery shopping. Vincent tried to make conversation while Sarah sat on an old couch, still wearing her wedding dress. He talked about his legitimate restaurant business and his plans to expand into other cities. He described the trips they could take together and the house they could buy in a nice neighborhood. Sarah listened in horror, realizing that Vincent had constructed an entire life plan that included her, without any input from her whatsoever. Back at the country club, Marcus called the police despite concerns from some family members that it might be too soon. Officer Janet Rodriguez arrived within 20 minutes and immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. A bride doesn't simply vanish from her own wedding reception. She called for backup and began interviewing witnesses, starting with the photographer who had seen the abduction. The photographer provided a detailed description of Vincent, including his approximate age, height, and the fact that he appeared well-dressed and nervous. Several other guests remembered seeing an unfamiliar man during the ceremony, but everyone had assumed he belonged there. Officer Rodriguez put out an alert for a possible kidnapping and requested additional resources to begin a wider search. At the farmhouse, Sarah tried a different approach with Vincent. Instead of showing fear or anger, she attempted to reason with him calmly. She explained that she barely knew him and that real love couldn't be forced or rushed. She told him about her relationship with Marcus and how they had built their connection over 3 years of dating, getting to know each other's families, dreams, and fears. Vincent listened but seemed confused by Sarah's words. He had convinced himself that the polite smiles she gave to strangers were signs of interest in him specifically. When she mentioned her love for Marcus, Vincent became agitated, insisting that Marcus couldn't possibly appreciate her the way he did. He pulled out photo after photo that he had secretly taken of Sarah over the past 6 months, showing her how carefully he had been watching and learning about her life. Sarah felt sick seeing the photos of herself at the grocery store, leaving school, walking her dog, and having coffee with friends. Vincent had been stalking her for months without her knowledge, building his obsession while she lived her normal life completely unaware. She realized that this wasn't a random crime, but a carefully planned abduction by someone who believed he was in love with her. The police investigation moved quickly once they had Vincent's description. Officer Rodriguez contacted the church to get a list of everyone who should have been at the wedding. They discovered that several guests remembered the unfamiliar man, but no one actually knew who had invited him. Security cameras from the church and country club were reviewed, providing clear images of Vincent's face. Marcus struggled with feeling helpless while the police worked. He couldn't understand how someone could target his wife or why this was happening to them. Sarah's family gathered at her parents' house, waiting for news and praying for her safe return. Elena kept Sarah's wedding bouquet in a vase, refusing to accept that her daughter's perfect day had been destroyed. At the farmhouse, Vincent prepared dinner using groceries he had brought earlier. He set the table with candles and tried to create a romantic atmosphere, completely oblivious to how traumatized and terrified Sarah was feeling. She forced herself to eat a small amount, knowing she needed to keep her strength up for any opportunity to escape that might arise. Vincent began telling Sarah about his family background, revealing that his uncle was involved in organized crime. He explained that he had tried to stay away from that world by running a legitimate restaurant, but his family connections meant he had access to resources and protection that most people didn't have. This information made Sarah even more frightened, realizing that her kidnapper had dangerous people who might help him if needed. The police got their first break when a gas station security camera captured Vincent's license plate number as he drove through a small town heading away from Chicago. Within hours, they had identified Vincent Rossi and discovered his connection to the notorious Rossi crime family. This revelation escalated the investigation to include FBI agents who specialized in organized crime. Agent Michael Foster took charge of the federal investigation and immediately recognized the dangerous implications of the case. If Vincent was acting on his own, there might be a chance to negotiate his surrender. But if the Rossi family was involved, the situation could become much more complicated and violent. Foster contacted his informants within the Chicago crime families to gather intelligence. Vincent's uncle Antonio learned about the kidnapping when FBI agents raided the restaurant looking for clues about Vincent's whereabouts. Antonio was furious, not because he cared about Sarah, but because his nephew had brought unwanted police attention to the family's legitimate businesses. He immediately called a meeting with his top associates to discuss how to handle the situation. Sarah spent her first night as a captive, trying to stay awake and alert for any chance to escape. Vincent had locked the bedroom door but left a window slightly open for fresh air. She tested the window and found it was painted shut, probably for decades. The house was too isolated for anyone to hear her if she screamed, but she noted every detail of the layout in case an opportunity presented itself later. Vincent couldn't sleep either, pacing around the house and constantly checking on Sarah. He had expected that once they were alone together, she would begin to see his point of view and warm up to him. Instead, she remained polite but distant, which frustrated and confused him. He started questioning his own plan, but couldn't bring himself to admit that he had made a terrible mistake. The next morning brought media attention to the case when local news stations picked up the story of the missing bride. Sarah's photo in her wedding dress was broadcast across the Chicago area, and tips began pouring in to the police hotline. The story captured public sympathy and outrage, with many people joining volunteer search efforts organized by Marcus and Sarah's family. Agent Foster received intelligence that Antonio Rossi was actively looking for his nephew, probably to eliminate the problem before it caused more trouble for the family. This created a race against time, as law enforcement needed to find Vincent and Sarah before the crime family did. Foster worried that if Antonio reached Vincent first, both Vincent and Sarah might disappear permanently. Vincent noticed increased police activity in the area when he drove to a nearby town for fresh supplies. He saw news reports about the kidnapping on television at a gas station and realized that his photo was being broadcast as a wanted fugitive. The reality of his situation began to sink in, and he started to panic about what would happen if he was caught. Returning to the farmhouse, Vincent found Sarah trying to pry open the painted window with a knife from the kitchen. Instead of becoming angry, he broke down crying and admitted that he didn't know what to do next. He had never planned beyond getting Sarah alone to talk to her, and now he was facing federal charges, family retaliation, and a woman who would never love him no matter how long he kept her captive. Sarah saw Vincent's emotional breakdown as her best chance to negotiate her freedom. She spoke gently but firmly, explaining that the longer this continued, the worse the consequences would be for everyone involved. She suggested that if he released her unharmed and surrendered to police, she would tell them that he hadn't hurt her and that he seemed to need psychological help rather than prison. Vincent was torn between his fantasy of winning Sarah's love and the growing realization that he had destroyed any chance of that happening. The sound of helicopters in the distance suggested that law enforcement was closing in on their location. He had to make a decision quickly about whether to surrender, run, or make an even more desperate choice that could end tragically for everyone involved. The helicopters grew louder as Agent Foster's team closed in on the farmhouse location. They had traced Vincent's cell phone signal to the general area and were using thermal imaging to search every building within a 5-mile radius. Foster knew they were dealing with an unstable individual who might panic and make a fatal decision if he felt cornered. Vincent watched through the farmhouse windows as police cars appeared in the distance, their lights flashing as they set up a perimeter around the property. He realized that someone must have seen him during his supply run, or that law enforcement had tracked him through technology he didn't understand. The fantasy he had built in his mind was crashing down around him. Sarah heard the approaching sirens and felt a mixture of hope and terror. While rescue seemed close, she knew that cornered criminals often made desperate choices that endangered their victims. She continued talking to Vincent in a calm voice, trying to keep him rational and prevent him from doing something that would get them both killed. Agent Foster established a command post at the end of the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. Through binoculars, they could see Vincent moving around inside the house, sometimes appearing at windows to look out at the surrounding law enforcement presence. Foster ordered his team to maintain distance and avoid any aggressive moves that might trigger a violent response. Vincent's phone began ringing constantly as news of the police surrounding the farmhouse reached his family. His uncle Antonio was furious, demanding to know what Vincent thought he was doing and ordering him to release the woman immediately. But Vincent was beyond listening to family authority. He turned off his phone and disconnected the landline, cutting off all communication with the outside world. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah could sense Vincent's increasing desperation. He paced frantically between rooms, occasionally stopping to peer out windows at the police presence. She noticed that he still carried the handgun, but seemed more focused on figuring out an escape plan than on threatening her directly. This gave her some hope that he might be convinced to surrender peacefully. Agent Foster used a megaphone to attempt communication with Vincent, identifying himself and asking for proof that Sarah was unharmed. He explained that they wanted to resolve the situation without anyone getting hurt and that Vincent could still make choices that would improve his circumstances. Foster's negotiation training told him to avoid making demands and instead focus on building rapport with the kidnapper. Vincent initially ignored the attempts at communication, but eventually opened a window and shouted that he just wanted to talk to Sarah without interference. He insisted that he hadn't hurt her and wouldn't hurt her if everyone would just leave them alone. Agent Foster recognized the delusion in Vincent's words and realized they were dealing with someone who might not be fully connected to reality. The standoff continued for several hours as negotiators tried different approaches to reach Vincent. They brought in a psychologist who specialized in obsessive behavior and stalking cases. Dr. Rachel Chin analyzed Vincent's background and suggested that his actions stemmed from a mental health crisis rather than typical criminal motivation. Marcus arrived at the command post despite police requests for family members to stay away. He was desperate to do anything that might help get Sarah back safely. Agent Foster allowed Marcus to make a brief statement over the megaphone, speaking directly to Vincent about how much Sarah meant to her family and asking him to let her come home. Vincent's response to hearing Marcus's voice was explosive. He screamed that Marcus didn't deserve Sarah and that he had been wasting her potential for years. This outburst revealed the depth of Vincent's obsession and convinced the negotiation team that reasoning with him would be extremely difficult. They began developing tactical plans for ending the standoff by force if necessary. Inside the house, Sarah decided to take a more direct approach with Vincent. She told him that she could see he was suffering and that his actions came from pain rather than evil intentions. She explained that forcing someone to be with you wasn't love, but was actually the opposite of love, which required freedom and choice to be real. Vincent broke down completely when Sarah spoke about love and choice. He admitted that he had been watching her because she seemed happy in a way that he had never experienced. His involvement with his family's criminal activities had left him isolated and unable to form normal relationships. Seeing Sarah's genuine kindness had made him desperate to be part of that happiness, even though he didn't understand how real relationships actually worked. This breakthrough moment gave Sarah the opening she needed to convince Vincent that releasing her was the right choice. She explained that if he truly cared about her happiness, he would want her to return to the life she had chosen. She promised that she would tell everyone that he had treated her well and that he needed help rather than punishment. Agent Foster noticed movement in the house and saw Vincent appear at the front door. He was no longer holding his weapon and had his hands slightly raised in a gesture that might indicate surrender. The tactical team prepared for multiple scenarios, unsure whether this was a genuine surrender attempt or a trap. Vincent opened the front door and called out that he wanted to make a deal. He said he would release Sarah unharmed if the police would guarantee that he could speak to a mental health professional before being arrested. Agent Foster immediately agreed to this request, knowing that getting Sarah to safety was the top priority. Sarah walked out of the farmhouse first, wearing a coat that Vincent had given her to cover her torn and dirty wedding dress. She moved slowly toward the police perimeter, looking back once at Vincent, who stood in the doorway watching her leave. Despite everything he had put her through, Sarah felt sad seeing how broken and confused he appeared. Medical personnel immediately checked Sarah for injuries while Agent Foster prepared to take Vincent into custody. Vincent surrendered without resistance, repeatedly apologizing to Sarah and asking if she thought he could get better with professional help. Sarah nodded and told him that everyone deserved a chance to change their life if they were willing to work at it. The reunion between Sarah and Marcus was emotional and overwhelming. Marcus had been prepared for the worst and couldn't believe that his wife was alive and relatively unharmed. Sarah's family rushed to the scene as soon as they heard she was safe, and Elena cried with relief while holding her daughter for the first time in 2 days. Vincent was taken to a secure psychiatric facility for evaluation while charges were being prepared. Dr. Chen's assessment revealed that he suffered from a severe case of erotomania, a mental condition where someone develops an obsessive love for another person who doesn't return their feelings. Combined with his family background and social isolation, this condition had led him to believe that kidnapping Sarah was a reasonable way to win her love. The media coverage of the case sparked discussions about mental health, stalking laws, and the resources available for people struggling with obsessive behaviors. Sarah's courage during her captivity and her compassionate response to Vincent's surrender were widely praised, though she preferred to avoid publicity and focus on recovering from her ordeal. Antonio Rossi publicly distanced his family from Vincent's actions and cooperated with federal investigators to demonstrate that the kidnapping was not sanctioned by the crime organization. This cooperation was partially motivated by genuine disapproval of Vincent's actions and partially by a desire to avoid additional law enforcement scrutiny of their activities. Sarah and Marcus decided to postpone their honeymoon while Sarah received counseling to help her process the trauma of being kidnapped. The therapy helped her understand that Vincent's obsession had nothing to do with anything she had done and that she wasn't responsible for his mental health crisis or his criminal choices. 6 months later, Vincent pleaded guilty to kidnapping charges and was sentenced to 10 years in prison with mandatory psychiatric treatment. Dr. Chen testified that with proper medication and therapy, Vincent could potentially overcome his obsessive behaviors and learn to form healthy relationships in the future. Sarah returned to teaching after taking a month off to recover. Her students and colleagues welcomed her back with cards and flowers, and she found that working with children helped her focus on positive things rather than dwelling on her traumatic experience. She also began volunteering with a support group for crime victims. The case led to changes in security procedures at local wedding venues, with staff being trained to watch for uninvited guests and to quickly respond to any suspicious behavior. Sarah and Marcus also worked with law enforcement to educate other couples about the importance of being aware of their surroundings and trusting their instincts when something seemed wrong. Marcus and Sarah eventually took their delayed honeymoon trip to Ireland, a place they had always wanted to visit together. Being able to travel freely and safely felt like a celebration of their survival and their commitment to building a normal life together despite the trauma they had experienced. Vincent continued his psychiatric treatment in prison and gradually began to understand how his actions had hurt Sarah and her family. He wrote letters of apology that were never sent, as his doctors advised that contact with Sarah would not be helpful for either of them. His recovery was slow but genuine, giving hope that he might eventually reintegrate into society without posing a threat to others. 3 years after the kidnapping, Sarah and Marcus welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Hope Elena after Sarah's mother and the hope they found during their darkest moments. Sarah often reflected on how the worst day of her life had taught her valuable lessons about resilience, compassion, and the importance of the love and support that surrounded her. The case remained a reminder for law enforcement about the unpredictable dangers that can emerge from mental health crises and the importance of treating such situations with both firm authority and compassionate understanding. Agent Foster often used Sarah and Vincent's story in training sessions to teach other officers about the complex factors that can drive someone to commit desperate acts. Sarah's wedding dress was carefully preserved by her mother, who hoped that someday it might be restored and perhaps worn by Hope when she got married. But Sarah told her mother that some things were better left as memories, and that Hope should have the chance to choose her own perfect dress when the time came. The farmhouse where Sarah was held was eventually demolished by its new owners, who wanted to remove the negative associations from the property. Local residents felt relief when the building was gone, as it had become a reminder of how quickly a peaceful community could be touched by violence and fear. Sarah and Marcus celebrated their 5th wedding anniversary by renewing their vows in a small ceremony with only their immediate families present. This time, Sarah wore a simple blue dress and felt truly peaceful, as she spoke the same words of commitment that had been interrupted years earlier by a stranger's obsession.